Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast Intersections, Mission to Innovate. This is our interview series where we bring practitioners from different disciplines to share their insights and real-world stories. Prachi Sutanka and Quan Collins are our hosts of this podcast that are created through the Samaya Studio. Prachi, do you want to kick us off today?
Thanks, Gracie. We are very glad that today in the Spark Studio, we have with us Keenan Johnson. Hey, Keenan.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Hey, Keenan, it's really hard to describe you in a few words as your work has spanned across engineering when you worked with SpaceX and then Impossible Aerospace, and more recently, nonprofits within the climate change industry. And through Samaya Studio, as you know, our vision is to bring exactly that kind of multidisciplinary thinking and acceleration to the innovation ecosystem. So Keenan, welcome again. You and I kept crossing paths within the same ClimateTech circles, and I think it was only a matter of time that you joined our podcast. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? And I would love to know what exactly motivated you to get into all these different fields. And because our podcast name is Intersections, I have to ask you, how do you see the intersections between your work and innovative technologies?
Yeah, of course. So thank you so much for the flattering background. I started my career, I think like most people, which is like having absolutely no clue, like what you're going to do.
Yep.
And like,
we all did.
Just like, I assume most people. And I think the thing that was really compelling to me when I sat down and looked at the possibility of all jobs that I could apply for, or choose okay, what am I going to study in college, and where do I kind of want to go? One of the things that was most interesting to me is which industries and areas have a really compelling storytelling aspect, which is which industries say that you can do anything and you can do really impossibly hard things. And that's what attracted me to aerospace, where I started my career. So I got to go do some awesome work in aerospace, and really, I think, learned what does that mean to have there is no limit to possibility as the base construct for your philosophy about how you do work, which I think is awesome. And I got to go work at SpaceX and do incredible work with reusable rockets. That experience, I think, was really interesting and taught me that oh wow, we should take this style of thinking and do this in other industries, thinking about climate or healthcare or manufacturing, some of these industries that I think definitely do not have that vision of success in the future right now. And that's what I think was really interesting to me. And so I wanted to pivot into climate because that was something that when I was in school was not really available as a job that you could go work on. And so I kind of just jumped in and founded a few startups based on climate tech, trying to take that version of the future of hope and aspiration and innovation and use that for climate in a not scary way. Because I think I was scared about climate as well. The messaging around climate has been quite scary for a long time. And so I finally saw the intersection of those two things and was yes, this is what I want to do. I want to go work on climate and try to figure out how to bring this aspiration, do the impossible mission storytelling into climate. And so I've been lucky to do that for quite a few years. And I've also been lucky to work with a lot of startups. I think I've probably coached over 100 startups now.
Wow.
I worked at a climate tech accelerator recently to try to figure out working with big companies as well and climate startups, how to bring a shared vision of innovation and acceleration together. And now I still do a lot of that coaching personally with startups and other big companies, but I've also founded a nonprofit to do some really interesting work in sort of a different innovative way, I think, around CO2 monitoring. And so I kind of do a lot of things, but I'm really excited about innovation and climate and doing things that aren't possible right now.
That's a fascinating story. And oh gosh, so many things that the whole patterns that you mentioned, that looking at patterns of innovation in one industry and applying that, that is extremely, I think, an optimized and important way, right, to do things. So that completely resonates with me. The other thing that resonates is that how divergent all of this is. And when I think of myself, I continue to use the term divergent. So completely understand where you're coming from. And finally, I have to say that I think climate job, that term is still so fluid, right? It's getting evolved, it's getting redefined, and I think only time will tell where we take that. So as you move through these different areas, some are startups or accelerators and your own nonprofit, different domains. One thing that we talk quite a lot as part of our podcast and some of the earlier episodes is the need to have a very thoughtful, collaborative structure around all this, right? Sometimes it is between different organizations, it's an inter-organizational collaboration. Sometimes it's within a large organization. Doesn't matter actually whether large or small, but how do you collaborate within an organization? Because a team is what takes it, right? It's what makes it or breaks it. So I'm curious, like, what would be a collaboration structure that perhaps doesn't exist right now, but in your opinion would be really useful or impactful to have?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because basically everybody in the whole world, if you're working at a company, is trying to think about how do we do better? Like how do we do innovation? And it's a really hard thing to do, especially if you haven't seen it modeled well before, which I think unfortunately most people have not been in a working environment where they have seen it. If they were, we would have more innovation. And I think the thing that I have always found to have a lot of success is this idea that innovation is success by running a bunch of tiny experiments, basically. So it's very difficult to achieve innovation via planning. Is kind of an unfortunate reality, and I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. Which is okay, let's plan out exactly how this innovation will flow, and it is not possible to do that.
Right. And I mean, to be honest, innovation itself is such a broad term. I've spent time discussing even what do we even mean here, right? So there is a lot of fluidity to it. And I believe that what can happen is to just only have a framework, meaning, have a general North Star or a compass, but not an exact map, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the frameworks that I wish existed more is the ability to have a framework to run experiments. So by that, I mean, let's say that you're a big company and you're looking at what if we, you've got maybe 5 other small technologies that you're what if we incorporated that into what we do? I think kind of the classical way that this is approached is all right, let's lay out a lengthy series of proposals and plans for how this will integrate into the grand strategy of whatever we're doing. And that can take many, many months or years. And unfortunately, a lot of times the innovation will just stop at some point during that process, either because the other organization loses interest or there are any number of reasons why that can fail. So where I've always seen success is when somebody is willing to take a very small bet and run a tiny experiment in sort of a contained way without planning out the total longevity. You probably have some general sense of the direction that you're going, right? And that okay, that we think there's a probability that this will integrate into the larger scheme of what we're doing, and we're willing to pay a very small amount of money to let 2 people sit over here and run an experiment for a little bit. And we haven't even talked about the legal IP framework or anything like that kind of stuff, which is where a lot of these things get really stuck. There isn't really a consistent framework to say how do we set up these little tiny experiments, whether that's between 2 business units in the same company, even or one company working with another company, or government working with a company, for example. There's no the tendency, I think, is to do a lot of paperwork and IP protection and really long-term planning. And I think we haven't seen a lot of success with that route. Innovation to me is more like a treasure hunt than farming. And it's you can't plan out exactly how the treasure hunt is going to go. So the only way to success is to try a lot of treasure hunts and see which ones play out.
Right. No, I love that analogy of treasure hunt. I think that says a lot. And maybe it sounds like, Keenan, maybe there is a little seed of that future startup that will build this framework or, do some work around it. Seems that way.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. I haven't, it's something that I've tried to do, like in the work that I do. And it's a strategy that I've had success usually with. And I wish it was practiced more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there are so many times where like just the inability to start the experiment just like kills the innovation process, right? So like, let's say you're somebody and you've got a great idea and you just need $500 and like one day like to test it.
Yep.
And in many working environments, it is not possible for you to get that. And so the idea is dead. and just having some framework by which you can create the funding and space to run those tiny experiments.
And I mean, you hit it. There are so many different aspects. It is carving that time. It is funding. It is that mindset. It is providing that, kind of sort of logical framework. And of course, many companies have tried that with, varying levels of success. But I think that framework is a core aspect of that. And I think just like we talk about frameworks, the other, aspect of all of this is the organizational culture. And Kuan and I, we talk a lot about this in different episodes of our podcast, but I would love to hear from you. What do you think are some of the different facets of a culture of innovation that are conducive to this innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think there are a few that I think are really important. One is psychological safety. So like if the people working in the org do not have psychological safety, you will not see innovative results, like full stop. I think that's the foundational bit. The second one, I think is autonomy, really. So like you have to give people some degree of autonomy to, to kind of test out ideas, even like, let's say, like just the ability to like ask like the right questions and like formulate kind of like new directions of thinking. I've been surprised often like how little autonomy that people have in a lot of working to actually do that, because a lot of times you're actually kind of punished for like doing something that is slightly anti-directional to the established like plan, or you're required to like get approval for everything that you do. And if that's the scenario, like you also I think won't have any innovation. You have to allow for some autonomy for people working in that innovative environment.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. And it's really, having that sort of top-down advocacy from the leadership, that also plays a huge role into that, right? Because they can really drive the safety, autonomy, the framework, and all kinds of different aspects. Totally. And this can be like a grassroots effort. I mean, those also, lead to something amazing many times. But I think it's just, if you want to bring the kind of agility, the kind of scale that's needed to tackle complex, large problems, then all of these ingredients just absolutely have to be there, right? So I would love to know a little bit more about some of the specific technologies that maybe either you are working on right now or have worked on in the past. And I mean, of course, within this ecosystem, there are always certain challenges. Some are really hard technological challenges. Some are more, some of the softer aspects that we've been talking about. But what challenges and barriers have you seen as you moved across these different domains and different, organizational?
I do quite a lot of things, but like probably the project that I'm like really super excited about right now is Ribbit Network. And our goal is to build a missing map of where do greenhouse gas emissions come from. And I looked at that, like, I think that problem is real and like should exist. Like we should be basing climate change action on data. And so I said, okay, like, yes, like, let's do that. Like, how can we do that? And that's just been a really interesting like, challenge to figure out like, okay, like what is the right kind of organizational container to put this problem in and solve? Because unfortunately, like there is no like for-profit business model today that will allow us to solve this problem, which is why it hasn't been solved so far. Right. And so I founded a nonprofit mostly because that was like the only option available. Like for-profit was not available. So, and I felt so passionate about that. It is a real problem that should be solved. And I think there will be funding in 10 years, but we don't have 10 years to wait in climate to solve this. So that's been really interesting. And I think it's been like really quite fascinating to figure out like, okay, like how can we put together like a technology-based, I call it a startup, because I think the ethos of it is the same of a startup, but working within a framework of nonprofits, which is very non-innovative right now. Right. Like most major nonprofits are incredibly uninnovative, I think, unfortunately. And a lot of that is culture, unfortunately. So trying to like unpack that culture and then also like the paperwork associated with having a nonprofit and trying to.
So you are almost innovating a new model here, right? Bridging the,
I think so,
best aspects of a nonprofit and a traditional startup.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see, hopefully in the near future, there will be a new wave of many like nonprofit startups. And by a startup, I think I define it as like some organization that has like a really grandiose vision of how the world will be different post your thing, which I think is what separates a nonprofit from just like, or a startup from like any other kind of business, for example. Like that's why like, I don't know, like a small like car wash is often not a startup. I would say like in my definition.
But an EV charging station and having those at scale, totally. You know, that there is a startup there, right?
For sure, yeah. And I think we've seen the trend in this direction. So if you look at like B corporations, like public benefit corporations as startups has been a big thing for the last 5 to 10 years. And I think it hasn't quite achieved the social impact that we had hoped, unfortunately. And so I think like, what is the next container for that impact mission? And I think it will be startup as nonprofit, though we have a lot of work to get there in terms of like, how do we make it easy to just do the paperwork, for example, or like figure out how people can contribute to this thing in like an easy way? Because a lot of those it's not trivial right now with sort of the system framework that we have. So that's like a really big challenge that I'm spending a lot of time right now to figure out how to put that volunteer base, the funding, and the nonprofit together to build technology that we can deploy at the same scale as a for-profit startup.
That's fascinating. And I think that's something you're probably, going to only solve by running those little experiments, right? Almost, and just doing it. So all the best for that. And I have to say, this has been a most fascinating dialogue. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you for everything you've done in the past and continue to do across different domains and specifically climate change recently. We hope to stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a joy.
What another fantastic episode. Thank you everyone for a great discussion. Make sure you stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at UAHI2C and follow Samaya Studio on LinkedIn. Bye everyone. Onward and upward.